This programming is sponsored by the
Any condition. Learn more at houstonpublicmedia.org/cars. And thank you.
Support comes from Moody Mansion, fully restored and open for self-guided audio tour. Galveston at 2618 Broadway, moodymansion.org.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. For more than 75 years, AU has supported freedom without favor and equality without exception. Learn more at au.org/NPR. From Workday, with AI at the core of its system, Workday is committed to delivering continuous innovation to prepare organizations for what's next. Workday, an enterprise platform for finance and HR rock stars. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White.
And I'm Todd Zwillig.
We're discussing the Department of Education with John Vallant. He's director of the Brown Center on Education Policy for Brookings. That's a nonprofit, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that conducts research in education and the social sciences. Also with us, Dana Goldstein, a reporter covering education and families for the New York Times.
And we want to hear from you. As always, what questions do you have on the workings of the Department of Education? What would you like to see the department do better? If you work at the Department of Education or in education, tell us about your work and how it interacts with Washington, why the Department of Ed is important. You can email us, 1a@wamu.org. John, before the break, we were talking a little bit about Title I. It's a dry name. Legislation always has titles, but Title I has had a lot of slogans behind it, a lot of politically sort of popular, unpopular names. Why do we talk so much about these slogans, and how do people know Title I in their daily lives?
Part of why we talk so much about Title I is because it's really important. And if you think about our education system, right now, so about 10% of the funding comes from the federal government. The other 90% is split between local and state sources. And if we had an education system that was funded entirely locally, entirely by property taxes, we would get these vast inequalities in the resources available to different communities to educate kids. And so we talk a lot about Title I because one of the really important purposes it serves is it helps to offset some of those inequalities that we would get from a purely property tax-driven system. State revenues also can kind of do that. And Title I sits within a much bigger, more comprehensive piece of legislation, which was initially called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was LBJ-era kind of war on poverty work that had Title I. It also had some other pieces to it. And then it has been, through the reauthorizations of that legislation, it has taken different names, one of them being No Child Left Behind. As Dana mentioned, that was sort of the most notorious, in some ways, form that it has taken. Right now, it is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which in some ways sort of pulled back from some of the stronger pushes that we were seeing from No Child Left Behind when it came to test-based accountability and some sanctions for schools.
Now, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a federal law that's administered by the Department of Education. Dana, what does that include? What protections does it offer students and their families?
This law basically says that if you have a child who's disabled, so perhaps they've been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, cerebral palsy, they're deaf, they're blind, this child has the right federally to a free and equal education to those of all other children in the most inclusive environment possible. So in other words, they'd be separated from other peers as little as possible. Now, the law has always been somewhat underfunded relative to the promises that it makes. And this leads to a lot of frustration for parents of these kids who feel that they're constantly having to fight their local school district to provide their children with what's promised by the law. But the law is a very important landmark piece of legislation in disability rights.
But Dana, I mean, this is disabled students. It's not a couple of kids. I was reading up on it. 7.5 million students qualify as special education in America under IDEA. That's 15% of all public schools.
Yes, and that number has grown. And what's interesting about disabled children as a group is, of course, it cuts across every other demographic. So it includes many kids who are low income, many who are middle class, many who are affluent. It includes kids of every ethnicity, every racial group. So this is a pretty powerful constituency politically, and I think any attempt refuse the delivery of services to this group would court a powerful political backlash.
We got this email from Eric who says, I'm a traveling teacher of the deaf in the rural Adirondack Mountains. How would getting rid of the Department of Education and the funds that go to special ed students with IEPs affect my kind of position? What can you tell us, Dana?
Well, I think it's important to say that getting rid of the Department of Education would not necessarily mean getting rid of programs like IDEA that serve disabled students or Title I that serve low-income students. These programs, these pieces of federal legislation predate the creation of the Department of Education. So when you look at something like Project 2025, which sketches out a plan for getting rid of the agency, at least as an interim step, what they say in there is that they will roll over the funding streams and the responsibilities for these programs to other agencies. Now, again, this is very theoretical. I don't actually predict that the federal Department of Education will go anywhere or that these pieces of legislation will be repealed, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but it would require Congress to do that, and it's just simply not the case. If you talk to folks in Washington, we're familiar with how Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate feel about education issues. It does not seem to be that there is a large enough majority of representatives that would vote for this. Now, in the Trump era, you don't really want to be in the prediction business because a lot of unpredictable things happen. So I think it's very important to take the incoming president's proposals seriously. There are certainly a lot of people in the Republican Party predating the Trump era or the arrival of President Trump on the scene who have always wanted to reduce the federal role in education and reduce funding. So I think, to answer that question, any reduction in federal funding for these groups will be a reduction in services for these students. But there's a difference between a reduction and a complete negation or cancellation of these programs, which is far less likely.
We got this email from Greta in Arlington, Virginia, who says a federal education department is unnecessary. It duplicates efforts and programs and policies that fall to local municipalities and are coordinated at the state level. John, I'd love to hear your response. Is there an advantage in having programs administered by the Department of Education versus being split between other departments or just being at the state or local level?
And to be clear, most of what happens in schools is decided at the state or local level. So if you are frustrated about what your kid is learning in social studies class or about which teachers are being hired or any of those kinds of things, those are by and large not decisions that are being made at the federal level, and they have never been made at the federal level. What the department does first and foremost is it administers programs that were created by Congress that someone has to administer. So when we have IDEA for students with disabilities and we have Title I for students in poverty, and then there are a whole bunch of other programs, we kind of need someone to do the day in, day out work of, for one, pushing those funds to the right places. So they have to get to the right states, to the right school districts, and then two, ensuring compliance. So making sure that when we're sending those funds to support students with disabilities all across the country, we need to make sure that the funds are actually getting to the right students and that the students' rights are being protected. And so the department serves those kinds of roles, and then it serves some additional roles that really are important, like protecting student civil rights in classrooms as outlined in federal law. So a sort of core function of the U.S. Department of Education, which it executes through its Office for Civil Rights, is it goes and makes sure that school districts are actually complying with the law when it comes to protecting student civil rights. And certainly local and state governments and schools and school leaders have a lot to say about what goes on. But we also need some kind of entity that is sort of keeping an eye on things and making sure that if someone runs in violation of federal law, that there is actually some kind of response.
Dana, we've heard about No Child Left Behind, Common Core, all of the slogan names for some of these programs. How do we know now how well schools are achieving, how well they're educating kids in public schools?
Well, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of good news in recent years on student achievement. Student achievement is down, and math and reading and gaps between high-performing and low-performing students have grown. This was exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, by school closures, and all the other stressors school based on where they live, and we have a lot of residential segregation by income and a lot of intergenerational poverty where low-income children are living in neighborhoods mostly with other low-income kids. They're going to schools that are less resourced in various ways, and as John mentioned, it's the federal funding that at least attempts to even out those resources. But because it is so difficult, to serve large concentrations of low-income children, schools that are in those neighborhoods have a very, very difficult task. I was most recently reporting for the New York Times about how migrant students, so those children who have come over the border over the past few years in this wave of immigrants that came across our southern border, have been clustered in a few schools in places like New York, Chicago, California, and in Denver, Colorado. And, these schools are very challenged by this influx of students. Now, these students are not necessarily very different from past immigrant students that we've been able to, bring into our society successfully. But just think about the money it costs. I mean, some of these children coming in have never before been in school, so they may be in 7th grade, but they may have never attended kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, or any other grade of formal schooling in their native countries. So it's a very big challenge. Think about the number of tutors you need to have, the number of bilingual staff. Think of how expensive that is. The federal funding just begins to scratch the surface of what's needed in schools like that. So we do not have educational equality in terms of outcomes. We don't really have educational equality in terms of resources. I mean, my child goes to a school that has huge PTA fundraisers every year at their public school, and they're able to do things like provide a science teacher when the city of New York, for example, cut funding for science teachers. So these things create inequalities in our system. And while the federal role has been to try to alleviate that, and in fact has done so to a certain degree, of course these inequalities still exist and are prominent.
We're speaking to Dana Goldstein. She's a reporter covering education and families for the New York Times. John Vallant, director of the Brown Center on Education Policy for Brookings, and 1A's Todd Swelling.
We got this email from Rose in New York, who's wondering about the potential abolition or even reduction of the Department of Education. What does this mean for my son, who has an amazing teacher in a Brooklyn elementary school? Will he no longer have his job, his tenure, and his union benefits with a pension, John?
Good questions. Most likely, no. That will not be affected. So again, the U.S. Department of Education is a relatively small player, both in making decisions about what happens at the school level and also in funding schools. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have an impact on schools. So one place where schools might start to see impacts, if we do start to see some real changes in the department, is, for example, the department may struggle to serve school districts in providing guidance around how it can spend funds and to ensure that the schools are spending funds appropriately. So it may be that funds are moving in the wrong directions. It may be that civil rights enforcement looks different in schools. So some protections, for example, the Biden administration has pushed for based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that is very likely to change in the Trump administration, in part because they can do that unilaterally without Congress. But when it comes to the kind of day in, day out, if you're a teacher working in this public schools somewhere in the U.S., there really hasn't been anything that I have heard when it comes to this, even the sort of big close the department rhetoric that I think would do that. And just to be very clear, I also think it is extremely unlikely that we see a true closing of the Department of Education. And I think it's very unlikely that we see a true elimination of any of these big popular programs like IDEA and like Title I. What is much more likely is that we see a sort of shrinking of the department and some attacks on some parts of it, and then potentially some changes in the kind of civil rights apparatus.
But then why is it such a target? I mean, you and Dana have both said Department of Education isn't going away. These programs are popular. Yes, it's politics. If that's true, why has it rattled around in my head for years and years and years that the Department of Education is the enemy and needs to be abolished?
My view on that is that it is in large part because the U.S. Department of Education is a symbol of U.S. public schools for a lot of people. And if you look right now at polling and what Americans think about public schools, there has been a nosedive in what the confidence that Republicans have in public schools as institutions. And so I think if I can find it here, I think I have a number, which is there was a Gallup poll in 2024 that asked Americans how much confidence they have in public schools, and it was only 15%